Thank you very much. Thank you. The emergence of contextual theology cannot be viewed in isolation from the general intellectual climate in the latter part of the 20th century. The increasing emphasis within philosophical discourse on the inability of human beings to transcend their culture, language, and the historical period in which they are situated has led to a recognition across a variety of different disciplines to the importance of context. The mediation of these ideas within theology is both direct and indirect, and in this paper I will situate the emergence of contextual theology in relation to this wider trend. I'll propose an alternative theoretical framework for contextual theology, epistemological particularism. I will then utilize this framework to explore a specific aspect of the Christian tradition in relation to a cultural group by focusing particularly upon the Akan, Ghana, and the Nicene Creed. Over the last 50 years, a general consensus has emerged among theologians that all theological reflection is essentially contextual. Thus, while theology has always been shaped by the culture in which it is situated, theologians today are explicitly conscious of this dimension. The phrase contextual theology emerged within the World Council of Churches Commission on World Mission and Evangelism in the early 1970s. Shoki Ko, a coordinator of one of the advisory groups for the WCC, coined the term in response to calls for a distinctive way of doing theology, which gave both contemporary culture and context a proper focus. Essentially, Ko defined the method of contextualization in theology as a continual interplay between scripture and context. However, over time, two distinct poles or emphases have emerged. Those who give priority to the context, or those who give priority to the text or scriptures. Gustavo Gutierrez's Theology of Liberation offers a paradigmatic illustration of an emphasis on the context pole, in that this is a theological reflection based upon the experiences of poverty in Latin America. In a similar vein, the founding of the Institute for Contextual Theology in South Africa sought to develop a theology starting from the situation in South Africa and not imported either from Europe, the USA, or Latin America. In this regard, the emphasis of these two approaches is firmly upon the context pole and a desire to allow the context to shape the contours of theological reflection. However, there are also a plethora of writers who prioritize the scriptures and the Christian tradition when doing contextual theology. Writers who emphasize this pole often maintain that the biblical text has a supra- or transcultural validity. An example of this is David Wells, but even David Bosch offers the same approach. For example, Wells writes, "Biblical revelation was given in a particular context, but what God the Spirit willed should be revealed was exactly what was written, and the content and intent of this revelation were alike transcultural. The biblical revelation, because of its inspired nature, can therefore be captive neither to the culture in which it arose or the culture in which it arrives." And a similar view is taken by the famous missiologist David Bosch, who writes this: "The Christian paradigm shift can only be carried out on the basis of the gospel, and never, however, against the gospel. Contrary to the natural sciences, theology relates not only to the present and to the future, but also to the past, to tradition, to God's primary witness to humans. Thus, relevance may never be pursued at the expense of God's revelation in and through the history of Israel and supremely the event of Jesus Christ. Christians take seriously the epistemological priority of their classical text, the scriptures." So both of these writers there's an epistemological undercurrent in both of these writers which yearns for a metacriterion that can determine orthodoxy within a multitude of contexts. However, while this is obviously seen in conservative thinkers, it is also manifest in prominent African theologians, and we'll come to those later. At a theoretical level, however, the difficulty here is how exactly contextual theologians might justify their desire to preserve the biblical revelation as a transcultural message relevant to all times and places, given the increasing skepticism within philosophy concerning claims to have privileged access to supracultural knowledge. The important role given to context in contemporary theological reflection has not occurred within a vacuum. Within philosophy, there has been an increasing emphasis on our inability to rise above the confines of the time and place in which we are situated. A central figure in the history of this development is Ludwig Wittgenstein. His work, Philosophical Investigations, rejected the idea that there is a correspondence between human language and notions of objective truth, and instead argued that meaning is determined by the grammar of the language in which it is defined. In sum, on this theory, meaning, truth, and knowledge is entirely contextual. If one accepts these presuppositions, then it is impossible to judge another culture or tradition on the basis of criteria found within a different, separate culture or tradition. This worldview presupposes an incommensurability of standards which makes adjudicating between A, a local culture, and B, the claims of a theological tradition, inconsistent with this epistemological orientation. To be clear, such a postmodern outlook does not prevent contextual theologians from creating what might be a thick description of either the text, the context, or whatever else. Nevertheless, this epistemological orientation entails the view that the diverse grammars upheld by the different webs of meaning spun in the text and the context are incommensurate. This makes judging between the heterogeneous features of text and context very difficult using a postmodern conceptual framework. And the following citation from Jean-François Lyotard illustrates this challenge. There are many different language games, a heterogeneity of elements. Where after the meta-narratives can legitimacy reside? Is legitimacy to be found in consensus obtained through discussion? Such consensus does violence to the heterogeneity of language games, and invention is always born of dissension. Postmodernism refines our sensitivity to differences and reinforces our ability to tolerate the incommensurable. Its principle is not the expert's homology, but the inventor's paralogy. And an American philosopher who makes a different but similar point, really, is Willard Van Orman Quine, who basically says, on this theory, it's very difficult to justify one discipline or one area of knowledge over and above another. So he uses the example of the Greek gods and modern physics, and he says, for my part, as a physicist, I believe in science, physical objects, and not in Homer's gods. And I consider it a scientific error to believe otherwise. But in point of epistemological footing, the physical objects and the gods differ only in degree and not in kind. Both sorts of entities enter our conceptions only as cultural posits. So what he's saying is, epistemologically, on this framework, you can't judge another language game or another tradition or another culture using criteria, whether in science or any other discipline. You've got to internally assess each thing according to its own grammar or criteria. So this makes, here we see that it is impossible to adjudicate between two different poles of contextual theology. Because if you're trying to judge the culture using the Bible, or the Bible using the culture, you're traversing between two different grammar structures. It's like judging French grammar with English grammar. It doesn't make sense. And this raises the question, as to whether an alternative approach might be more suitable to the task in hand. At this juncture, I want to suggest an alternative which can help contextual theologians to adjudicate between the knowledge contained within a particular context and their own theological tradition. At this point, it is helpful to illustrate how a particularist epistemological orientation would enable contextual theologians to affirm both the knowledge contained within a said context, the knowledge contained within a theological tradition, and then also to adjudicate between them. Inspired by the writings of Roderick Chisholm, this approach begins by assuming that people have knowledge prior to obtaining a philosophical degree. Indeed, Chisholm maintains that epistemology begins with knowledge, what we think we know. It is from this point a presupposition of knowledge, antecedent to criteria, that the particularist evaluates what they think they know, exploring how it might be justified. So the particularist reverses the standard way of thinking about epistemology. Rather than beginning with a method or criteria outlining what is and is not true belief, a particularist assumes the knowledge already in their possession to be valid, and then retrospectively explores how these beliefs might be evaluated. While this might appear strange, given that philosophers have tended to presuppose rules or criteria determining the parameters of knowledge, beginning with knowledge is not as ridiculous epistemologically as it might seem. Chisholm illustrates the problem with the approach that we might normally take, where we begin with a criteria for knowledge. And this is the problem of the criterion. To know whether things really are as they seem to be, we must have a procedure for distinguishing appearances that are true from appearances that are false. But to know whether our procedure is a good procedure, we have to know whether it really succeeds in distinguishing appearances that are true from appearances that are false. And we cannot know whether it does really succeed unless we already know which appearances are true and which ones are false. And this is a circle, because unless you know what knowledge is, you can't create a criteria to determine what knowledge is. That's his point. Put simply, those who would say we must begin with criteria for identifying genuine knowledge are unable to find such criteria without already knowing what real knowledge is. However, rather than succumbing to postmodern despair because we cannot locate such criteria, we can instead assume that we do possess genuine knowledge claims. I have 2 hands. Here they are. I have 2 feet. I know that, and I can retrospectively formulate criteria as to how I know that. This approach is helpful for contextual theologians. A particularist orientation allows contextual theologians to recognize the knowledge claims emerging from A, the said context, and B, the knowledge claims in their specific theological tradition. It is from this epistemological starting point, in which A, context, and B, theological tradition, are presupposed, that we can move to C, a retrospective examination as to how differences between these might be resolved. To do this, we must ensure that as far as possible, we develop criteria appropriate to the case in hand. And to illustrate how this might work, I want to talk about how in Ghana, discussions of the Nicene Creed have been engaged by 2 famous Ghanaian theologians. Having illustrated the differences between a postmodern and a particularist epistemological orientation, it is helpful to illustrate how this approach might illumine the encounter between Nicaea and the Akan from Ghana. Thus, the section now we're under will probe certain facets of the Akan worldview, briefly summarize some of the central features of the Nicene Creed, and explore how the claims to knowledge contained in these might be evaluated. The meteoric growth of Christianity in Ghana has led to the theological absorption of central features of Akan culture. Nevertheless, it is also true that the Akan have a very different ontology from the Greco-Roman world in which Christian doctrine emerged. In contrast to the Greco-Roman pantheon with its assembly of gods, the Most High God for the Akan, Onyame, Onyankopon, is one and indivisible. Onyame, the creator, Oboadie, did perform the creation of all things himself. Thus, in contrast to Greek and Roman deities, who often delegated tasks between various different gods, Onyame did the work of creation himself. Therefore, while Akan ontology is populated by Abosom, positive Onhohompa and negative Onhohombone, spiritual agents or forces, these are not technically lesser deities, but powerful spiritual beings that are feared and inspire worship. However, the only reason that human beings engage with Abosom is that they think the chasm between humanity and Onyame is unbridgeable, rendering intermediaries necessary. In addition to the above, Azaza represents Mother Earth and matrilineal ancestors, Nananom and Samanfo, who can intercede on behalf of humanity. Nevertheless, Onyame, Onyakopon, remains the supreme Most High God. In sum, there might be other powerful agents, but there is no other God but God. As will be seen below, this worldview clashes with the understanding of God formulated at Nicaea 1700 years ago. The Nicene Creed was formulated at the Council of Nicaea 325 AD. The council was convened following considerable conflict about the real nature of Jesus Christ. The Arian heresy had denied that Jesus was fully God, and the Doctist heresy denied that Jesus was fully human. As a result, the Creed affirms that Jesus is both human and divine. Over the last 1700 years, the Nicene Creed has come to define Christian orthodoxy, and quite literally, to affirm the Creed requires one to affirm that Jesus is fully God and fully man. This differs from the Akan worldview. The above illustrates the way in which Nicene Creed and Akan beliefs differ about the nature of God. This is not to dispute that Christianity in Ghana has readily assimilated a number of features contained within the worldview of the Akan people, including the creation of the world by the Most High God, the chasm between humanity and God which cannot be bridged, and the need for mediators and sacrifices to engage the Most High God. Nevertheless, as the eminent Ghanaian theologian John Poby highlights, the fundamental claim of the Nicene Creed that Jesus is fully human and divine has created confusion in the mind of Akan recipients. How can these different knowledge claims be evaluated? The difficulty highlighted by this case study is essentially this: where the said culture does not contain a concept that has been central to Christian orthodoxy, contextualization reaches an impasse. Unfortunately, a postmodern framework does not contain adequate tools to resolve the problem. Therefore, while there are of course a host of theologians who have looked at the problem, I want to focus on two renowned Akan theologians who explore this question, John Poby and Kwame Bediako, so as to illustrate how a particularist approach offers a solution to the impasse between context and text. Thus, in specific relation to the particular question, we will begin with Poby, who emphasizes context, and then explore Bediako's approach. In his work toward an African theology, Poby acknowledges that expressing Jesus' humanity is relatively easy, but explaining the idea of Christ's divinity is very difficult in Akan culture. However, rather than giving priority to the Nicene Creed, he stresses the historical contingency of this Hellenistic formulation of Christianity, which he describes as being alien to Akan people. Moreover, he contends that the language and concepts of the Creed are alien to modern language and thought forms. As a result, he considers that our heavy indebtedness to Greco-Roman culture leads us to unhelpful metaphysical speculation. Instead, he emphasizes that the Bible is almost reluctant to refer to Jesus as God. Thus, it might be argued that Poby's decision to focus on the Scriptures uncovers a desire to prioritize the Akan culture and thus revise Nicene Christianity. A different approach is taken by Kwame Bediako. In his work Jesus in African Culture, Bediako is critical of Poby and argues that his analysis is flawed because he approaches the problem largely through Akan wisdom sayings and proverbs and does not deal sufficiently with the religious nature of the question. In addition, he does not let the biblical revelation speak sufficiently in its own terms into the Akan situation. He too easily assumes similarities between Akan and biblical understandings and underestimates the potential for conflict. For if we claim as the greatest ancestor one who at the superficial level does not belong to his clan, the Akan non-Christian might well feel his identity and personality are taken away from him. This would indicate Bediako's criticism of Poby is that he does not give sufficient importance to the biblical revelation, suggesting that Bediako's desire in this particular case is to give priority to the creed's central claims over and above the Akan worldview. This interpretation, in which we suggest that Bediako is prioritizing text over context, is reinforced by Bediako's description of certain aspects of the Akan tradition, such as ancestors, as myth, what he calls a projection that has no independent existence from the community that produces them. Having illustrated the way in which these prominent Akan theologians engage with this particular question, it is apparent that the challenge facing both of these writers remains the methodological basis on which they seek to bring the Christian tradition and Akan culture into dialogue. On what basis can they critique context using text, or vice versa? This is where a particularist epistemological orientation becomes useful to both writers, regardless of their final conclusions. While a postmodern framework does not permit a critique of one culture or tradition on the basis of another, a particularist approach could enable this. Contextual theologians who seek to give priority to the second pole, the Christian tradition, can begin by affirming all the aspects contained in the culture that cohere with their beliefs, while critiquing those which do not. Thus, Kwame Bediako's desire to recast the central claims of the Christian tradition using African concepts becomes possible, and that is in that he is able to both uphold what he believes to be central to the Christian tradition and synthesize these elements with traditional African concepts. Likewise, those seeking to emphasize the cultural pole over against the Christian tradition can affirm all those aspects of the Christian tradition which cohere with their cultural perspective while rejecting those which do not. Put simply, whichever pole one wanted to emphasize, a particularist epistemological orientation enables legitimate critique of those features which conflict with the pole prioritized. Thank you very much.